If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you probably imagine is a nice family dinner with roasting chestnuts. That is a laugh. My name is Kelly Watson, and my Christmas involved being on my knees scrubbing a rug while my parents sold my future to pay for my brother's vacation. It makes you depressed as hell realizing you are just an asset to be liquidated. But the funny thing about being treated like furniture is that nobody suspects the furniture is recording every word. If you want to see a dynasty crumble in real time, listen close. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. It started on the drive up, with the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the ice. The snow came down in sheets. It was a heavy, wet snow that stuck to the windshield and fought the wipers. I drove the old sedan up the winding road of the driveway. The tires slipped on the asphalt, but I corrected the wheel and kept moving. Ahead, the house loomed through the white noise of the storm. They called it the Oaks. It was a sprawling brick structure with white pillars and too many windows. It did not look like a home. It looked like a fortification built to keep the world out and the money in. I stopped the car at the top of the drive. The engine ticked as it cooled. I looked in the rearview mirror. My face was pale. I looked tired. The dark circles under my eyes were from 60-hour weeks at the firm, from drafting motions and reading depositions until my vision blurred. I straightened my collar. Pinned to the lapel of my black blazer was a brooch. It was a heavy piece, an antique pearl cluster that had belonged to a grandmother I never met. I touched the center pearl. It was cold against my fingertip. Inside the casing, hidden behind the intricate lattice of gold and nacre, was a high-definition lens. I pressed the small button on the back of the setting. A tiny vibration buzzed against my chest. It was recording. I stepped out into the cold. The wind cut through my coat. It was a wool coat I had bought 3 years ago, and the hem was fraying, but it was warm. I walked to the front door and did not knock. I used my key. The lock turned with a heavy, expensive click. Inside, the air was still and smelled of pine needles and beeswax. The foyer was vast, with a black and white marble floor that shone like ice. Robert and Eleanor were standing in the archway of the living room. They held crystal tumblers of scotch. They looked like statues preserved in amber and money. They were beautiful people, in the way that things which have never done manual labor are beautiful. Their skin was smooth. Their clothes were tailored to the millimeter. "You're late," Robert said. He did not look at his watch. He just knew. He was my father, but he spoke to me like I was a junior associate who had missed a filing deadline. He took a sip of his drink. "The roads are bad," I said. "The plows haven't been out past the highway." Eleanor stepped forward. She did not hug me. She reached out and touched the sleeve of my coat. Her nails were manicured a soft pink. "Kelly, you look windblown. And this coat, it looks like something a student would wear. Did you come straight from the city?" "I came from work," I said. "I worked this morning." "On Christmas Eve," she said. It was not a question. It was a judgment. "Well, go put your things in the cloakroom. Try to do something with your hair. We have guests. The magazine people are already setting up in the dining room." I nodded and walked past them. The floor was hard under my boots. I could feel the weight of the brooch pulling at my jacket. It was a physical weight, but also a moral one. I hung my coat in the closet, but I kept the blazer on. I checked the angle of the brooch in the mirror on the closet door. It was straight. It saw everything. I went through the side door into the kitchen to breathe. The kitchen was the engine room of the house, stainless steel and white tile. It was full of movement. The catering staff moved with a precision that was almost military. They wore black uniforms, crisp and unstained. They were chopping, plating, and pouring. The air smelled of roasting meat and rosemary. Standing at the island was the head of the crew. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He was wiping down a knife. This was the producer. We had met 3 times in coffee shops in the city, places where my parents would never set foot. He looked up. His eyes were dark and intelligent. He did not smile. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. We are live. The feed is good. Water, he asked. His voice was neutral professional. Please, I said. He handed me a glass of water, our fingers brushed. His hand was warm. Everything is on schedule, he said, his voice low under the noise of the exhaust fans. The lighting is set. The microphones are planted in the centerpiece and the sideboard. Just get them talking. Be natural. I don't have to try to be natural, I said. They do the work for me. I drank the water. It was cold and clean. I felt a sudden surge of adrenaline, a sharp metallic taste in my mouth. I was not just a daughter anymore. I was a spy in the house of my childhood. There was a loud crash from the front of the house. The front door slammed against the wall. A voice boomed out, echoing off the marble. The prodigal son returns, hide the good scotch. It was Kyle. I put the glass down and walked back into the foyer. My brother stood in the center of the hall. He was 24, 2 years younger than me. He wore a cashmere sweater that cost more than my monthly rent. His face was flushed red from the cold and from the gin he had been drinking since noon. He had a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He dropped it on the floor with a thud. Kyle. Eleanor's voice changed. It went from the flat, critical tone she used with me to a high, musical vibration. She rushed to him. She embraced him, burying her face in his shoulder. You made it. We were worried about the storm. Storm? What storm? Kyle laughed. He looked over her shoulder and saw me. His grin was lopsided. Hey, Kel, still wearing the paralegal uniform, you look like you're about to serve me a subpoena. Good to see you, Kyle, I said. Robert walked over and clapped Kyle on the back. It was a man-to-man gesture full of pride. Good drive, easy, Kyle said. The rover handles the snow like it's sand. I need a drink. Dining room, Robert said. We're opening the 98. They moved as a unit, a 3-person phalanx of wealth and ease towards the dining room. I followed them. I was the shadow trailing the light. We entered the dining room. It was a cavernous space with high ceilings and a chandelier that dripped crystal. The table was set for 4. The china was Limoges white with a gold rim. The silver was heavy sterling polished until it mirrored the room. In the corners of the room, the tripods stood like sentinels. The black cameras were sleek and modern. The crew, the caterers, were making final adjustments to the lights. They had set up soft boxes to diffuse the glare. Eleanor stopped and preened. She smoothed her silk dress. She touched her hair. She believed these people were from Connecticut Living. She believed they were here to document the Watsons' charitable contributions and their elegant holiday traditions. She thought she was the star of a puff piece. She did not know she was the antagonist in a tragedy. Is the lighting all right here? Eleanor asked the producer who had followed us in. I don't want shadows under the eyes. The lighting is perfect, Mrs. Watson, the producer said. It captures everything. Just be yourselves. Pretend we aren't here. I'm ready, Kyle said. He pulled out a chair. The wood scraped against the floor. He sat down heavily. Let's eat. I'm starving. I took my seat. The chair was stiff. I sat opposite Kyle. My parents sat at the heads of the table. The cameras hummed. The red tally lights were small eyes in the darkness of the room's corners. I touched the brooch again. I looked at my family. They were smiling, but their eyes were empty. They were ready to perform. I took a breath and prepared to let them destroy themselves. The soup was a lobster bisque. It was rich and heavy, served in shallow bowls that looked like wide white eyes. The steam rose up and dissipated in the cool air of the room. The cameras in the corners were silent black obelisks. I could feel them, but my parents and Kyle had already forgotten them. They were performing, but they thought they were performing the role of the benevolent aristocracy. They did not know the genre of the film had changed. I ate slowly. The spoon clicked against the porcelain. It was the only sound in the room for a long moment, aside from the faint whir of the heating vents. The head caterer. The producer stood by the swinging kitchen door, his hands clasped behind his back, watching. He was a statue of servitude, but his eyes were sharp. Robert broke the silence. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. "The bisque is adequate," he said. "A little heavy on the sherry, perhaps, but adequate." "I'll tell the staff," Eleanor said. She took a sip of her wine. It was a white burgundy, crisp and expensive. "Kyle, tell us about the trip. We haven't heard the details. You were in Cabo for 3 weeks. Kyle leaned back in his chair. He had already finished his first glass of wine and was pouring a second. The bottle was a heavy Bordeaux, a vintage my father had been saving. Kyle handled it carelessly, gripping it by the neck. "Cabo was wild," Kyle said. He grinned, showing his teeth. "Just wild. You know, getting away from the grind." I looked at him. Kyle had graduated 2 years ago with a degree in communications that he had barely scraped together. Since then, his grind had consisted of waking up at noon and playing golf at the club. "What grind?" I asked. I kept my voice low level. Kyle waved a hand, dismissing me. "The pressure, Kelly. You wouldn't get it. You like your little paperwork job. You like the rules. I'm a creative. I need space." He turned back to Robert. "So we rented these jeeps, me and Topher. We decided to go off-road near the cliffs. The view is insane. You can see the whole ocean." "Sounds dangerous," Eleanor said, but she was smiling. She liked the idea of him being dangerous. It made him seem important. "Nah, not really," Kyle said. He took a large swallow of wine. His face was becoming animated. "Although we did have a little incident. I took a turn too fast on the sand. The traction down there is a joke. The jeep spun out. We rolled it. Just once. Into a ditch." I stopped eating. "You rolled a jeep." "It was fine," Kyle said. He was talking with his hands now, large sweeping gestures that claimed the air around him. "The roll bar did its job. We crawled out. Topher was laughing his ass off. The rental company was pissed, obviously. They tried to keep the deposit." "And?" Robert asked. He was not angry. He was amused. "And I told them who you were," Kyle said. He pointed a finger at Robert. "I told them to check the name on the credit card. They backed off. We didn't pay a dime for the damage." Robert chuckled. It was a dry sound like leaves scraping on pavement. "Good man. Never let them gouge you. It's a principle." "Exactly," Kyle said. "It's about dominance." He was excited now, fueled by the approval and the alcohol. He gestured wide with his right hand to emphasize his victory. He forgot he was holding the wine glass. The crystal stem snapped against the edge of the heavy oak table. The goblet didn't break, but it tipped. The dark red liquid launched out of the glass. It hit the tablecloth first, a violent splash, and then cascaded over the edge. It landed on the rug. The rug was white Irish wool, thick and hand-knotted. It had been in the family for 3 generations. The wine hit it and bloomed instantly, a dark arterial red spreading across the pristine white fibers. The silence that followed was absolute. The cameras did not move, but I knew they were capturing the spread of the stain. It looked like a wound in the floor. "Kyle?" Eleanor breathed. She stared at the rug. She did not look at her son to see if he was cut. She looked at the wool. "That is the Donegal rug." "It slipped," Kyle said. He didn't apologize. He looked at the glass in his hand, annoyed that it was empty. "The stem is too thin. It's cheap design." Eleanor turned her head. She looked at the catering staff, but then she stopped. She looked at me. Her eyes were hard. "Kelly." "Yes," I said. "Don't let it set," she said. Her voice was cold, a command issued to a subordinate. "You know how to get red wine out. You used to do it for your grandmother. Get the club soda and the salt. Now, before it soaks the backing." I looked at her. I looked at the catering staff. They could have done it. They were paid to be here. But Eleanor wanted me to do it. It was a power dynamic. It was a reminder of my place. I was the responsible one, the one who cleaned up messes. Kyle made the messes. I erased them. "The salt is in the pantry," I said. "Well, go get it," Robert said. He picked up his fork. "Don't just stare at it." I stood up. I walked into the kitchen. The producer was there. He handed me a canister of salt, and a bottle of club soda, and a stack of white rags. He did not speak, but his eyes were intense. He nodded toward the dining room. "Go back," the nod said. "This is gold." I returned to the dining room. The family had resumed eating. The clinking of silverware against china had started again. I walked to the stain. I knelt down. The floor was hard against my knees. I poured the club soda onto the wine. It fizzed, turning pink. I poured the salt. It piled up like gray slush. I began to scrub. I was on my knees in my blazer and slacks, scrubbing a rug while my family ate dinner 3 feet above me. The smell of the wine was overpowering. It smelled sour and metallic. I pressed the cloth into the wool, twisting my wrist, absorbing the liquid. The camera in my brooch was now at eye level with the table legs. It was recording the intricate carving on the claw feet of the table. It was recording the scuff marks on Kyle's Italian loafers. It was recording the way my mother's heels tapped impatiently against the floorboard. "So," Robert said, his voice booming above my head. "What is the plan now? You're back for how long?" "Just a month," Kyle said. I heard him pouring more wine. The liquid glugged into the glass. "I'm thinking Europe. I need to see the world, Dad. Really see it. Not just a vacation. A tour. The grand tour. Like the old days." "Europe," Robert mused. "London, Paris, Rome, and Berlin," Kyle said. "Prague. I want to get into the art scene. Maybe buy a few pieces. Network with some gallery owners. I have this idea for a curation business, but I need to be there. I need to be on the ground." I scrubbed harder. The salt was abrasive against my fingertips. The stain was stubborn. It was deep in the weave. The physical exertion made me hot. I could feel sweat prickling on my back. I was the help. I was the invisible machinery that made their lives work. "It's a good time for it," Eleanor said. "You're young. You should explore. You don't want to be tied down yet." "Exactly," Kyle said. "But it's not cheap. To do it right, I don't want to stay in hostels. You can't network from a hostel. I need to be in the mix. I need the right hotels, the right wardrobe. I need to be able to buy dinner for people who matter." "What's the number?" Robert asked. He cut his steak. I heard the knife saw through the meat. "Startup capital," Kyle said. "For the year. Living expenses, travel, a fund for acquisitions." I ran the numbers. 100,000. I froze. My hand stopped moving on the rug. $100,000. That was 2 years of my salary. That was the down payment on the apartment I had spent 5 years saving for, the apartment Robert had co-signed for, but I had paid for. 100, Robert repeated. He chewed his steak slowly. "It's an investment," Kyle said quickly. "In me, in the brand. I'll pay it back when the gallery takes off." "Don't worry about paying it back," Robert said. He sounded casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "The market has been good this quarter. Very good. We can move some assets around, liquidate a few things that aren't performing." "So yes?" Kyle asked. "Yes," Robert said. "You leave in January. Do it right. Make us proud." "Thanks, Dad," Kyle said. "You won't regret it." "I know I won't," Robert said. I looked down at the rug. The stain was fading, lifting into the salt, but the ghost of it remained. A pale pink shadow on the white wool. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold, but from a rage so pure it felt like clarity. I was down here scrubbing the byproduct of Kyle's carelessness out of the floor while they handed him a fortune. They didn't even ask me to stand up. They didn't offer me a plate. I was part of the furniture. "Kelly," Eleanor said. She didn't look down. "Is it coming out?" "Yes," I said to the floor. "It's coming out." "Good," she said. "When you're done, bring the next bottle from the sideboard. Kyle is empty." I finished scrubbing. I gathered the wet wine-soaked rags. I stood up. My knees cracked. The blood rushed back into my legs. I felt dizzy for a second. I picked up the dirty rags and the salt canister. I looked at the table. They were smiling at each other. A perfect family tableau. Kyle raised his glass to Robert. Eleanor beamed at her son. I walked to the sideboard. I put the cleaning supplies down on a silver tray right next to the crystal decanters. It was a jarring image, the dirty rags next to the luxury, but they didn't notice. I picked up the next bottle of wine. I walked back to the table. I poured Kyle's glass. I poured Robert's. I poured Eleanor's. I stood there holding the bottle. There was no glass for me. No place setting had been added. The bisque bowls were being cleared by the catering staff. The producer moved in close to take the bowls. He looked at me. He glanced at the brooch. He winked. I sat back down in my chair. My hands were red and raw from the scrubbing and the cold club soda. I placed them on the table right on the linen cloth. The redness of my skin was a stark contrast to the white fabric. So, Robert said, turning to me finally, his eyes sliding over me like I was a spreadsheet he didn't want to read. Now that Kyle is sorted, we need to talk about your situation. The air in the room shifted. It became thinner. The cameras seemed to lean in. The rising action was over. The trap was set. I looked at my father. I touched the pearl on my chest. What situation? I asked. Your living situation, he said. And the dinner ended and the war began. I sat with my hands on the table. They were red and swollen from the cold water and the salt. The skin felt tight. I looked at the table setting in front of me. There was the placemat, the heavy silver fork, the spoon, and the knife. But there was no plate. The space between the cutlery was empty white linen. The catering staff moved around the table, serving the main course. It was prime rib, thick slabs of meat, with the bone in dark on the outside and pink in the middle. They placed a plate in front of Robert. They placed a plate in front of Eleanor. They placed a heavy steaming plate in front of Kyle. They skipped me. The producer walked past. He held a silver boat of au jus. He poured the sauce over Robert's meat. The steam rose up smelling of thyme and beef fat. He did not pour any for me because there was nothing to pour it on. He moved to the side of the room, blending into the shadows near the heavy velvet drapes. He caught my eye. His face was stone, but his hand tapped his thigh once. Wait. I folded my hands. I did not ask for food. I knew they wouldn't offer it. This was part of the punishment. I had been late. I had looked disheveled. I was the help. Excellent, Robert said. He cut into the meat. The juice ran onto the china. Cooked perfectly. Eleanor, the staff, is an improvement over last year. They came highly recommended, Eleanor said. She cut a small piece of beef. By Kelly, actually. She sent the contact info. Did she? Robert didn't look at me. Well, even a broken clock, I suppose. Kyle was eating with enthusiasm. He shoved a large piece of meat into his mouth. Grease shone on his chin. So, he said, chewing. What's the situation? You said we needed to talk about Kelly's situation. Robert put his knife down. He took a sip of the wine I had poured him. He looked at me then. His eyes were blue and flat, like the water in a swimming pool in winter. Yes, the situation. We've been reviewing the portfolio, Kelly. Year-end assessments. Looking at liquidity. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew that tone. It was the voice he used when he was about to fire a vice president or sell off a subsidiary. And, I asked, the real estate market in the city is peaking, Robert said. Inventory is low. Buyer demand is at an all-time high, especially for pre-war walk-ups in your district. My district, I said. You mean my neighborhood? I mean the asset on 4th Street, Robert said. The condo. I stopped breathing for a second. The room seemed to tilt. What about it? We're listing it, Robert said. He picked up his knife again. On Monday. The broker already has the paperwork. We should get a quick close. Cash offers likely. I looked at him. I looked at Eleanor. She was busy arranging asparagus on her fork. She wouldn't meet my eyes. You can't list it, I said. My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs right against the hidden camera. That's my home. It's an asset, Robert corrected. And it's in my name. It's in our names, I said. You co-signed because I didn't have the credit history out of law school. But I pay the mortgage. I pay the HOA fees. I pay the property taxes. I paid for the new floors. I paid for the kitchen renovation. You paid for maintenance, Robert said dismissively. That's what tenants do. But the deed, Kelly, the deed is the only thing that matters in a court of law. And the deed lists Robert Watson as the primary owner. You're just occupying the space. I have put $70,000 of my own money into that place, I said. I gripped the edge of the table. You told me it was my inheritance. You told me if I fixed it up and made the payments it was mine. That was the deal. Verbal agreements, Robert said, smiling slightly. You're a paralegal. You know what a verbal agreement is worth in real estate. Nothing. I looked at Eleanor. Mother, you know how hard I worked on that place. I sanded those floors myself. I spent my weekends painting. Eleanor sighed. She looked bored. Kelly, don't be dramatic. It's just an apartment. It's small. It smells like the subway. You don't need to be living in the city anyway. It's not safe. A young woman alone. I have a job, I said. I have a life. My firm is 10 minutes away. You can commute, Eleanor said. Or better yet, you can move back here. Here. I looked around the room. The dark wood, the heavy curtains, the suffocating silence. The guest suite is empty, Eleanor said. The basement unit. It has its own entrance. You can come and go as you please within reason. We could use the help around the house. The housekeeper is getting old. You could manage things. It would save you money. I don't want to save money, I said. I want my home. You're evicting me. Is that what this is? You're evicting your daughter on Christmas Eve. We're liquidating an asset, Robert said. Don't take it personally, it's business. We need the capital. For what? I asked. You have millions. Why do you need the equity from my $300,000 apartment? Robert gestured with his fork toward Kyle. Kyle was busy sawing at the bone of his steak. For the tour, Robert said. For Kyle's year abroad. And for the lake house. Eleanor wants to redo the dock and add a sunroom. Contractors are expensive. We need cash on hand. I looked at Kyle. He stopped chewing. He looked at me, his eyes wide and innocent, like a child who has just been given a toy another child was playing with. You're selling my home, I said slowly, to pay for his vacation and a sunroom. It's not a vacation, Kyle said. It's a grand tour. It's cultural. He needs to see the world, Eleanor said. He needs to find himself. You've already found yourself, Kelly. You're stable. You're a worker. Kyle is an artist. He needs support. I'm a worker because I work, I said. I'm stable because I built a foundation. You're ripping it out from under me. We're reallocating resources, Robert said, to where they are most needed. Kyle has potential. He just needs a runway. You're fine. You can live in the basement. It's warm. It's free. You should be grateful. Grateful, I repeated. The word tasted like ash. I worked 60 hours a week to pay down that principal. I skipped vacations. I drove this car into the ground so I could make the double payments you insisted on. And you're taking it to give him a party fund. It's my money, Robert said. His voice dropped an octave. It became hard. It was my credit that bought it. It is my equity. It's my life, I said. Your life exists because I allow it, Robert said. He put his fork down with a clatter. Let's be clear, Kelly. I am tired of this entitlement. You think because you pay the bills you own the store? No. You are a tenant. You have always been a tenant. I own the property. I own the capital. And in this family, the capital rules. That's not fair, I said. It's not right. Fair. Robert laughed. He picked up his wineglass. You sound like a child. Fair is a fairy tale for poor people. There is no fair. There is only leverage. I have the leverage. You have nothing. Therefore I decide. That is how the real world works, Kelly. The weak serve the strong, the owners eat the meat and the tenants scrub the floor. You would do well to remember that. The weak serve the strong. The sentence hung in the air. It was perfect. It was a manifesto of his cruelty. It was the soundbite that would end him. I looked at the cameras. I knew they had it. The audio on the brooch was sensitive. It would have picked up the wet click of his tongue against his teeth. "Is that how you see me?" I asked. "As the weak, as a servant." "I see you as you are," Robert said. "Useful when you are told what to do. Obstinate when you forget your place. Moving to the basement will be good for you. It will humble you. You've gotten too arrogant in the city, thinking you're independent." "I am independent," I said. "Not anymore," Robert said. "Monday morning the sign goes up, pack your boxes. Or don't. We can hire movers to throw it all in a dumpster. It's up to you." He went back to his steak. He cut a piece, swirled it in the blood and juice, and ate it. He didn't look at me. The conversation was over. He had won. I looked at Kyle. He was wiping his plate with a piece of bread. He caught me looking at him. He smirked. It was a small, greasy smile. "Don't be jealous, Kel," Kyle said. "It's just business. Besides, the basement isn't that bad. It's got that little window near the ceiling. You can see people's feet walking by. It'll be cozy." He laughed. A short, sharp bark of a laugh. "You're taking my house," I said to him. "You know I paid for it. You know that money is mine." "Dad says it's his," Kyle said, shrugging. "And Dad is the boss. Maybe if you were nicer he wouldn't do it. But you're always so intense. You bring it on yourself." "I bring it on myself," I said. "Yeah," Kyle said. "You're a buzzkill, always have been. Now pass the salt. This meat needs salt." I reached for the salt cellar. My hand was shaking. I gripped the heavy silver container. I wanted to throw it. I wanted to throw it through the window, through the lens of the camera, through the facade of this entire life. But I didn't. I pushed the salt toward him. He took it without saying thank you. I looked at Eleanor. She was sipping her wine, looking at the chandelier. She was humming a Christmas carol under her breath. Silent night. I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was the calm of a soldier who has just radioed in the coordinates for an airstrike on their own position. The bridge was burned. The ships were sunk. There was no going back. I had lost the apartment. I had lost the inheritance. I had lost the illusion that these people loved me. But I had something else. I raised my hand to my chest. I felt the brooch. The pearl was smooth and hard. I pressed the button on the back again, a double tap to mark the file. I turned my head toward the shadows near the kitchen door. The head caterer was standing there. He was watching me. He had heard everything. He had heard the eviction. He had heard the weak serve the strong. He had heard the dehumanization. I looked him in the eye. I didn't blink. "Did you get that?" I said. My voice was clear. It cut through the room. Robert stopped chewing. He looked up confused. "Get what? Who are you talking to?" Eleanor lowered her glass. "Kelly. Who are you talking to?" I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the producer. I repeated louder this time. "Did you get that?" The producer stepped out of the shadows. He walked into the light of the chandelier. He was no longer a servant. He walked with the heavy, confident stride of a man who owns the footage. "We got it," he said. His voice filled the room. "Every word. Audio is crystal clear." Robert dropped his fork. It hit the plate with a loud clank. "Who the hell is this?" I stood up. I pushed my chair back. It fell over with a crash. I didn't pick it up. "That," I said, pointing at the producer, "is the man who just bought my apartment." The producer smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Actually," he said, "I think we bought the whole house." The atmosphere in the room broke. It did not shatter like glass. It dissolved like sugar in hot water. The structure of the dinner, the hierarchy of the service simply evaporated. The waiters stopped being waiters. They stopped pouring wine and clearing plates. They became technicians. They checked battery levels. They adjusted the focus rings. They looked at their watches. The servitude was a costume, and they had taken it off. Robert stood at the head of the table. His face was a deep, congested red. The veins in his neck corded against his collar. He looked at the producer, then at the crew, then at me. He looked like a man who had woken up in a room he did not recognize. "Who are you?" Robert demanded. His voice was loud, but it lacked the weight it had held 5 minutes ago. "I said get out of my house. I'll have you arrested for trespassing. I'll have you buried." The producer didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. He slid it across the mahogany table. It spun and stopped right next to Robert's wine glass. "I'm not a caterer, Mr. Watson," he said. "My name is David Miller. I'm the showrunner for Rich and Ruthless. We air on Tuesday nights. Cable, prime time. Maybe you've seen it?" Eleanor made a sound like she had been punched in the stomach. She pressed a hand to her throat. That trash," she whispered. "That show where they expose scandals." "We call it accountability television," Miller said. "But sure, trash works too. It pays very well." "You have no right," Robert shouted. He slammed his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. "This is a private residence you are recording without consent. I will sue you for everything you own. I will sue the network. I will have this footage destroyed before it leaves the driveway." "I don't think you will," I said. I reached down into my leather bag, which I had left by the leg of my chair. I pulled out a blue folder. It was thick. I placed it on the table. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood was final. It was the sound of a gavel. "What is that?" Eleanor asked. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the folder. "Paperwork," I said. I opened it. "You signed these on Tuesday, Mother. Remember, I sent them over by courier. I told you the production team needed releases for the Connecticut Living web series. I told you it was standard liability for the lighting equipment." "I signed them," Eleanor said. Her voice trembled. "I signed for the magazine." "You signed a standard appearance release and a location agreement," I said. I turned the document around so they could see the signatures, Robert's heavy scrawl, Eleanor's elegant loop. "You didn't read them. You never read them. You just like seeing your name on the line." I put my finger on paragraph 4. Clause 4. The producer retains the right to use the footage, audio, and likeness of the signatory in any media throughout the universe in perpetuity for any program produced by the production company, regardless of working title. The working title listed on page 1 is The Holiday Project. The production company is listed as R&R Media LLC. R&R, Miller said helpfully. Rich and Ruthless. Robert snatched the paper. He read it. His hands shook. The paper rattled. He read the clause again. He looked for a loophole. He looked for a way out. I watched his eyes scan the legal boilerplate. I knew what he was looking for. He was looking for leverage. But I had drafted this writer myself. There was no leverage. "This is fraud," Robert spat. "You misrepresented the project." "Did I?" I asked. "I said a film crew was coming to document the Watson family Christmas. I said it would show the world who you really are. I never lied, Dad. You just assumed who you really are was something flattering. You assumed the world would see the benefactors, the aristocrats. Instead, they're going to see the man who thinks fairness is a fairy tale for poor people." "You can't use that," Kyle said. He looked sick. "The weak serve the strong thing. You can't put that on TV. I'll get canceled. I'll lose my followers." Miller laughed. It was a dry, professional laugh. "Kid, that line is the tagline. It's going on the billboard in Times Square. The weak serve the strong. It's perfect. It encapsulates everything wrong with this country in 5 words. You're going to be the face of entitlement for a generation." "Kelly," Eleanor pleaded. "Eleanor." She reached across the table. Her hand hovered near mine, but she didn't touch me. "Kelly, please. Think about the family. Think about our name. Your grandfather built this reputation. You're destroying it." I'm not destroying it, I said. I'm just turning on the lights. You destroyed it. You destroyed it when you decided I was a tenant in my own life. You destroyed it when you chose a vacation over my home. We can fix this, Robert said. He was bargaining now. The anger was fading, replaced by desperation. The apartment. You want the apartment, fine. I'll sign the deed over. Tonight. I'll write a letter. We'll stop the listing. It's too late, I said. It's never too late, Robert said. Money fixes everything. How much, Miller, is it? How much to kill the tape? 500,000, a million. Miller signaled the crew. They began to break down the lights. The bright, diffuse light of the production vanished, leaving the room in the dimmer yellow glow of the chandelier. The house suddenly looked older, darker. We don't take kill fees, Mr. Watson, Miller said. The ad revenue for this episode alone will be 10 times that. Besides, we're on a schedule. Editors are waiting in the van. Miller looked at me. He nodded. We're done here. Great work, Kelly. Truly. That bit with the rug. We couldn't have scripted that. The symbolism was chef's kiss. Thank you, I said. The crew moved efficiently. They collapsed the tripods. They coiled the cables. They stripped the microphones from the centerpiece. They were erasing their presence, leaving only the wreckage of the family dynamic behind. Robert sank into his chair. He looked small. The power he had wielded so casually 10 minutes ago, the power of property, of money, of patriarchy, was useless against the lens. He had been captured. He was content now. He was a clip on a timeline. Why? Eleanor whispered. She was crying now, silent tears that ruined her makeup. We raised you. We gave you everything. You gave me a loan, I said, and you called it love, and then you called in the debt. I stood up. I felt light. The heavy wool coat in the closet was waiting for me. The cold air outside was waiting. I looked at the table one last time. The half-eaten prime rib. The spilled wine stain, now a dull purple bruise on the white rug. The silence was back, but it was different. It wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of a tomb. You should probably check your email, Dad, I said. I sent my resignation to the firm an hour ago, and I CC'd the partners on the release forms. They don't like bad press. You might want to call your PR team. You're going to have a busy week. I turned my back on them. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. The footage would do the talking. The rising action was over. The climax had passed. Now everything was just falling down around them like the snow outside. I walked into the foyer. The marble floor was just as cold as it had been when I arrived, but the space felt different. It was no longer a cavern of intimidation. It was just a hallway in a house that belonged to the bank and the past. The crew was efficient. They were hauling the equipment cases out the front door, their boots leaving wet, muddy tracks on the white stone. No one offered to clean them up. The illusion of the pristine sanctuary was broken. David Miller was waiting for me by the heavy oak door. He had put his coat on a thick parka that looked utilitarian and warm. He held a thick manila envelope in his hand. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake. He treated me like a partner in a heist, or a co-conspirator in a necessary demolition. Here, he said. He extended the envelope. I took it. It was heavy. What is this? Your copy, he said. Fully executed. Countersigned by the legal department this morning. It guarantees your royalties, your back-end points on syndication, and the exclusivity clause. You own the narrative, Kelly. We just distribute it. And the payment? I asked. I needed to hear it. Wired, Miller said. It cleared 10 minutes ago. Chase to chase. Instantaneous. You can check it. I nodded. I held the envelope against my chest, covering the pearl brooch that had recorded the last hour of my life. It felt like a shield. You're a scary operator, Kelly, Miller said. He opened the door, letting the winter wind swirl into the hall. I've produced shows about cartels and congressmen. I've never seen anyone dismantle a family over an appetizer. Cold-blooded. It wasn't cold blood, I said. It was survival. Whatever you call it, Miller said. It makes for great television. Watch the premiere. You're going to be a star. I don't want to be a star, I said. I just want to be solvent. Miller laughed, zipped his coat, and walked out into the snow. The door didn't close all the way. It stayed ajar, leaking heat into the night. I stood there for a moment. I could hear them in the dining room. They were shouting now. The silence had shattered into a chaotic noise of blame. I heard Eleanor sobbing a high, thin sound. I heard Kyle's voice rising in a whine, asking about his followers, asking about his reputation. And I heard Robert. He was roaring. He was threatening lawsuits. He was threatening to kill the messenger. But he wasn't coming into the hall. He stayed in the room where he felt he was king, even though the castle had been sold out from under him. I turned to leave. My eyes fell on the closet door. My coat was inside. It was a gray wool coat, 3 years old, with a lining that was torn in the sleeve and a hem that was unraveling. It was the coat of a paralegal who budgeted for subway fare. It was the coat of a daughter who came home to beg for her own property. I stared at the brass handle of the closet. I thought about opening it. It was 10 degrees outside. The wind was howling. To walk out there in just a blazer was dangerous. It was irrational. But then I thought about putting that coat back on. I thought about the weight of it. If I put it on, I was still Kelly the tenant. I was still Kelly the disappointment. I turned away from the closet. I left the coat. I left the scarf. I left the boots I had worn to walk up the drive. I would buy new ones. I would buy a coat made of cashmere. I would buy boots lined with shearling. I would buy them with my own money. Money that didn't come with conditions or lectures or eviction notices. I stepped through the front door. The cold hit me like a physical blow. It bit through the thin fabric of my blazer instantly. The wind whipped my hair across my face. My skin contracted and I gasped. It hurt. It was a sharp, cleansing pain. It felt real. The air inside the house had been stale, recycled, dead. This air was alive. It tasted of ice and pine and vast empty distance. I walked down the steps. The snow was ankle deep. It soaked into my loafers. I didn't care. I crunched through the drifts toward my car. The old sedan sat alone in the driveway, covered in a fresh layer of white powder. It looked small and beaten down, a relic of my old life. I got in. The leather seat was freezing. I slammed the door, shutting out the wind. The silence inside the car was absolute. I put the envelope on the passenger seat. I keyed the ignition. The engine groaned, protested, and then caught. The heater blasted cold air, then slowly, reluctantly turned lukewarm. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My fingers were stiff. I unlocked the screen. The light was bright in the dark cab. I opened my banking app. Face ID recognized me. The little circle spun. The balance refreshed. $500, $400, $1,200. I stared at the number. $500,000. It was the price of a reputation. It was the price of a relationship. It was the price of the truth. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place. It was enough to buy the condo outright. It was enough to tell the partners at the law firm to go to hell. It was enough to disappear. I put the phone down. I put the car in gear. The tires spun for a second on the ice, losing traction, and then they bit. The car lurched forward. I drove down the long, winding driveway. The trees were black skeletons against the gray sky. I reached the bottom of the hill and stopped at the iron gates. They sensed the car and swung open slowly, grinding against the snow. I checked the rearview mirror. The house sat on the hill. The lights were on in the dining room. I could see the silhouette of my father standing in the window, looking out into the dark. He looked small. From this distance, the great estate of the Oaks was just a pile of bricks and mortar. It was just a building. It held no magic. It held no power. I remembered what I had said to him. I hadn't said it out loud in the hall, but I had said it with my eyes, and I had said it with the contract. You were right, Dad. The weak serve the strong. But you mistook who was who. He thought strength was money. He thought strength was holding the deed. He didn't understand that strength was the ability to walk away. Strength was the ability to burn the bridge while you were standing on it just to see the other side. I looked away from the mirror. I looked at the road ahead. It was a ribbon of black asphalt, cutting through the white landscape. It led to the highway. The highway led to the city. The city led to anywhere I wanted to go. I pressed the accelerator. The car moved through the gates. I didn't look back. The heat finally kicked in, blowing hot and strong against my frozen hands. I was alone. I was homeless for the night. I had no family. I had never been more free. And just like that, the heavy gates of the oaks closed behind her, sealing the past away forever. If you found satisfaction in Kelly's liberation, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We want to hear your take. Was her revenge justified? Let us know below because we read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.